All right. Hello, Nutrition 101 students. So in this video, we're moving on to Chapter 8, which is all about energy balance and body composition. So just like some of the other topics we've been discussing in this course, this is a commonly misunderstood and often quite touchy subject. So as usual, I will be focusing on what pieces of information are research-based, backed by science and evidence, and trying to dismantle or at least give you the context around some of the more misunderstood measurements and ideas around what is a healthy or healthful body weight, etc. So generally around the idea of weight and body composition, the most simplistic way to address that is to just think about how many calories are getting into the body versus how many calories are being burned by the body. Right? We know the energy density of all of our molecules, and we've used that to calculate multiple things. And so in general, if you are consuming just as many calories as you are burning, then you should assume that your body is going to maintain its weight, maintain the amount of cells and structures that are in it. Whereas if you are consuming less than you are burning, then your body is going to have to get that energy from somewhere. And we could assume that it would get that energy by breaking apart the molecules and structures that it already has, or some of the stored molecules that it has, like glycogen and fat in your adipose cells. And so then on the opposite end of the spectrum, if you are consuming more calories than you are burning, your body may store those calories so that you have access to them for later. But again, that is a super simplistic way of looking at it. That does not consider all of our other factors that we know have some impact on body weight, such as hormonal factors, which certainly impacts your body weight. Genetic factors, which have some support around them, some scientific background, pointing us towards a couple genes that may be impacting your overall body weight. And then some of our more correlational and just kind of logical factors that just make sense as far as impacting your body weight, such as your development, behavioral factors like habit building, and then social factors such as how the people around you treat food or utilize food. So we'll talk a little bit about all of this. And so again, going back to that simplistic general view of energy balance, if the amount of calories going in meets the amount of calories being burned, then we should have a balance, right? Shown at this figure at the bottom, right? Where your weight should be, or you could assume your weight would be maintained. There's no reason to break anything down because you are supplying your body with the energy that it needs to do whatever work it's doing. And so if you burn more than you are bringing in, right, that should result in your body breaking down some of its stored molecules or some of the structures that it's utilizing. And then the opposite, if you're consuming more than you're burning, your body should be storing that extra energy for later in the form of something like adipose tissue or glycogen. But again, not totally accurate, a really simplistic view, but maybe enough for some of you. And so let's break down and look at all these factors that go into how much energy your body is burning throughout the day. And so the most significant portion is going to go towards our basal metabolic rate. So if you ever see this acronym BMR, it's referring to basal metabolic rate, which is just describing in general the amount of energy your body needs just to keep it running at rest. And rest means no physical activity at all, like asleep, basically. Because the next portion, physical activity, which contributes 20 to 35% of our total energy expenditure, is anything above rest. So sitting, even though this is a generally restful position, I am still activating muscles in order to maintain this position. Right? So sitting, walking, standing, these are all part of your physical activity, not part of rest. And then the last component is going to be the thermic effects of food. So in order to eat, digest, absorb, and transport all the molecules in your food, that's going to require a bunch of chemical reactions. And as we just learned in the last chapter, every chemical reaction is going to result in some amount of energy being lost as heat. Right? It's that chaotic, uncontained kinetic energy. And so around 5 to 10% of the energy you're expending in a day is just going towards this cost of metabolism, the cost of breaking down, absorbing, and transporting those molecules throughout your body. And that cost is going to differ depending on what types of molecules you're consuming, because things like proteins and carbohydrates require more energy and more chemical reactions to transport than something like fat, which just simply diffuses across the membrane. So breaking down those things a bit further, our energy expended to maintain base, resting, or functions of the body, or sorry, let me back up. The energy expended to maintain the base functions of the body, aka our rest, that is your basal metabolic rate, again, BMR. And generally, I guess I was about to say no matter what, in almost every case, your BMR is going to be higher than any of those other categories. Right? The more physically active you are, the more lean body tissue your body is going to produce, and lean body tissue is going to be more metabolically active than something like fat tissue. And so there are ways you can manipulate this basal metabolic rate, which is going to come down to, at the most basic level, how much muscle or lean tissue you have versus adipose tissue or fat that is in your body. Because again, muscle tissue is much more metabolically active than your adipose tissue. Muscle and neurons are going to be the most metabolically active cells in your body. They need the most energy in order to maintain themselves. And so the more muscle you have, the higher this basal metabolic rate is going to be. And then generally, after you reach your fully mature age of around 25 to 30, your basal metabolic rate is going to start decreasing at a rate of about 3 to 5% per decade. So 3 to 5% every 10 years after you have reached that peak. So generally, younger people are going to have a higher basal metabolic rate than older people. And if you wanted to estimate your basal metabolic rate, we do have a algorithm for calculating it. So you would need to convert your body weight to kilograms if you're used to measuring in pounds here in America. But everything that we're talking about, all the calculations in this chapter are going to be using the metric system. So kilograms and meters for something later. So convert your body weight into kilograms and then multiply that by 1 per hour. So if you wanted to determine how much energy you are burning per day, you would convert your body weight to kilograms and then basically just multiply that by 24 to get your total amount of energy burnt throughout the day just at rest, just to maintain your body. So I already talked about some of these, but some other factors that can increase or decrease your basal metabolic rate. Again, a major one going to be the amount of lean body mass, so how much muscle you have. Being taller in stature is going to increase your basal metabolic rate just because of how much surface area you are exposing to the environment. Your levels of thyroid hormone, which is a major driver of metabolic activity in your body. So a more active thyroid or greater levels of release of thyroid hormone are going to increase that basal metabolic rate, stimulate more metabolic activity compared to less or lower levels. We already mentioned generally the younger you are, the higher your basal metabolic rate is. Stress and anxiety are going to increase your basal metabolic rate. Whereas fasting or dieting, so not eating for certain periods, is going to slow down your body's metabolism because it wants to reserve its energy in order to maintain your body through that period of fasting or dieting. In general, biological males burn more energy per hour than biological females. And this is referring to biological sex, not gender, so it's based on hormones. Pregnancy and lactation, creating a whole new body outside of you or generating molecules to feed that new baby is going to require more energy in order to upkeep that. So that is going to increase your BMR. And then sleep, where you are at a full rest, is going to put you at your lowest basal metabolic rate possible. And then any drug that is considered a stimulant, such as caffeine, nicotine, those things are going to increase your basal metabolic rate, increase all of the chemical activity happening in your body because it is stimulated. Right. So our next greatest proportion of energy expenditure throughout the day is going to come from our physical activity, from utilizing that lean body tissue, utilizing those muscles, which requires a lot of energy to do this. And again, this includes everything above basal level, above sleeping, resting. So sitting, standing, walking, talking, those are all utilizing your muscles. So that is all part of your physical activity. And depending on how active you are, this is going to consume 20 to 35% of your total energy budget throughout the day. And we can calculate this as well. And we are going to practice this. Right? So we have some known energy costs for different activities. And even this isn't going to be a perfect system. These are generalized values telling us how many calories are burned per kilogram of weight per minute. And so since we are using a value that is kilocalories per kilogram per minute, we can take that known energy cost and multiply that by the weight of the individual, and then multiply that by the amount of time spent doing that activity in order to fully calculate how much energy is being spent doing that activity. And so we have some practice here on the next slide to talk about it. So we're going to do 2 examples with an individual that weighs 50 kilograms. So we know our weight, right, which we said was going to be an important factor of this. So now we need to figure out which activity we're doing to determine the energy cost, and then how long we're doing that activity. So an individual who weighs 50 kilograms, how much energy will they expend stretching for 30 minutes? So now we have our time and our weight. We just need to find our energy cost. So let's find stretching on our table here. If we go down, we've got stretching. If we go over, we found our energy cost, which is 0.044 kilocalories per kilogram per minute. So now let's jump over to my Word document that I set up for this. Zoom in a little bit. All right. So a reminder of our algorithm here, energy cost times weight times time. So we know our weight is 50 kilograms. And for our first activity, we are going to be stretching, which costs 0.044 kilocalories per kilogram per minute. And we're doing that for 30 minutes. So we would take our energy cost, 0.044 kcal per kilogram per minute. We can multiply that by our weight, 50 kilograms, and multiply that by the amount of time spent doing this activity, 30 minutes, which is going to give us our overall energy expenditure. So I'm going to pause and calculate this. Okay, just went to my calculator, and if you follow this setup here, 0.044 times 50 times 30, you should get 66 kilocalories, essentially being burnt doing this activity, right? So we know it's 0.044 per kilogram per minute, multiplied that by our weight in kilograms, and we know we're doing it for 30 minutes. So 30 minutes of stretching should burn 66 kilocalories for this individual. And so for the next example, I asked you to do the same calculation for this individual who weighs 50 kilograms if they were to bicycle for less than at a speed of less than 10 miles per hour, because we have a few examples of bicycling in our table here, and if they were going to do that for 1 hour. So again, going back to our table, bicycling at less than 10 miles per hour is going to cost 0.07. So we have like bicycling at 12 to 13.9 miles per hour. So that's why I specified the speed here. So 0.07 is our energy cost. So we can set up our calculation the same way, 0.07 kilocalories per kilogram per minute times 50 kilograms. And again, we want to have our time set up in minutes. So I told you this individual is going to be bicycling for 1 hour. We would not put 1 hour here. That's going to give us a different value. We need to convert 1 hour into minutes, which is 60 minutes. So make sure you're doing that with any example question that you're being given. And so now I'm going to pause and jump to the calculator again, and I'll come back with how many kilocalories we have burnt. So make sure you are also pausing and trying this out, and so that you can compare your answer with me, and then reach out if you are confused or have any questions. All right, so after putting these values into the calculator, I determined that this individual will be burning 210 kilocalories doing this activity for 1 hour. So kind of a cool generalization, right? We've got lots of tools and technology now that kind of do this for us, right? If you have a smartwatch that tracks activity. But this is where that information is coming from, or where it started, right? With this idea of energy cost being kilocalories per kilogram per minute times weight times time. So go ahead and practice a couple more on your own so that you feel confident doing this activity. And of course, you'll probably have some practice on the quiz this week. All right. So our very last portion of energy expenditure, as far as major energy expenditure, is that thermic effect of food. And again, this is the amount of energy expended, the heat lost in order to process food. Okay. So in general, this is going to come down to 5 to 10% of the amount of energy you are consuming, really, depending on what type of molecules you are consuming in your food. So again, fats require the least amount of energy to fully digest, absorb, and transport because they simply diffuse across the membranes. We don't need active transport to move them. Whereas proteins and carbs are going to require a little bit more energy since they are going to need some help getting across the various membranes they will cross throughout their journey in our bodies. All right. So that's all of the factors that go into how much energy you're burning throughout the day. And now we can look at other factors that contribute to the amount of weight you are carrying, essentially. And so we have a couple hypotheses or ideas around genetic factors that impact body weight. So mainly these are coming from these three hypotheses, or the main three that are discussed, at least in the textbook, are the thrifty gene hypothesis, the set point hypothesis, and the leptin hypothesis. You may also refer to these or see these referred to as theories, like the thrifty gene theory, the set point theory, the leptin theory. But that term theory has a much stronger meaning in science than it does in everyday speech. And so that's actually an improper use of the term theory. Theory would require a strong amount of evidence and scientific support behind it, making it essentially the accepted explanation for this phenomenon. And none of these have met that level, so they could not actually be considered a theory in science. So hypothesis is a much better term here. But we'll look at all of these. Essentially, the thrifty gene hypothesis has the weakest amount of support behind it. The set point hypothesis has a decent amount of support behind it, but no real scientific evidence showing us that this would be true. And then leptin, which is a hormone, much easier to study in a lab and get much more direct evidence to support it, is going to be our strongest genetic hypothesis here. So let's take a look at all of them. So the thrifty gene hypothesis, which if you're familiar with the term thrifty, you could probably get an idea already of what this might mean. So if someone is thrifty, they are generally very careful with their money and they don't like to spend their money. They prefer to save. And so they'll buy used items instead of brand new in order to get a good deal, right? And so this thrifty gene hypothesis is describing individuals whose bodies are thrifty with their energy. And so someone who has the thrifty gene would burn less energy, and thus they would gain weight more easily. And so the idea was there is some gene, some genetic factor here individuals can inherit that is going to strongly determine whether or not they gain weight based on how much energy they utilize. And from an evolutionary perspective, this had some logic behind it. The idea being that populations that experienced periods of feast and then famine. So if you were like a hunter-gatherer community where you may go long periods of time without catching a fresh meal, your body would want to have, or it would benefit the body to be able to be thrifty with its energy, to store that energy for much longer so that you could survive during those periods of famine where you were waiting in between meals. And then when you get your large meal, you eat a whole bunch and store that energy for later, and just going through these periods again, over and over again, of feast and famine. And this idea was first hypothesized and first published in the 1960s, looking at Native American populations as the focal point, seeing that there were really high rates of obesity and type 2 diabetes in these populations, even though their diets weren't necessarily that different than the surrounding populations. And so the idea was that because in historically in North America, there would be these periods of feast and famine where there would be long periods where you didn't have access to a large amount of calories. And so these individuals had developed that thrifty gene, right? But then if you start considering other factors outside of just their evolutionary history, there was a lot of conflicting variables. And then if we look at other populations that had a similar evolutionary history with periods of feast and famine that were not showing these high rates of obesity and diabetes, that kind of completely toppled apart this hypothesis. So there isn't very much support for the thrifty gene hypothesis any longer. But that was an idea that once upon a time had some at least logic and reasoning behind it as a strong support. So our next genetic-based hypothesis is the set point hypothesis, first published in a paper in the 1980s. And this has a decent amount of indirect evidence. There hasn't been any controlled scientific study around this idea, but there is a lot of just observational correlational evidence that seems to back up this idea, which is that your body is set to maintain a particular point. So the set point hypothesis is describing that your body is designed to stay within a certain range of weight based on either genetics, like what was passed down to you, and or your early childhood development. At some point, your body got used to weighing this amount, and so it will easily bounce back to that point because it thinks that is where it is supposed to be. That is how it has, that is what it has become conditioned to, what it is used to. And we have lots of, again, correlational observational evidence behind this, such as rebound weight gain among dieters. So it's very, very frequent that someone who goes on a diet for whatever period of time, by the end of that diet, they will easily regain that weight regardless of sticking to that diet or not, or I guess not regardless, but it is just very easy for them to regain that weight if they don't continue sticking to that very strict diet. And we saw this a lot from a TV show that used to be popular in America here called The Biggest Loser, where a bunch of contestants competed to lose as much weight as possible in a short period of time. Most of the contestants on that show very quickly went back to their original weights after leaving the show. And then the opposite side is also true, the occasional overeating, or there's also evidence from the opposite side that occasionally overeating, eating more than your body is burning doesn't end up leading directly to a large amount of weight gain. So in general, there does seem to be some sort of set point, some sort of homeostasis conditioning that your body gets used to and thus bounces back to that original weight. However, studies have shown that you can shift that set point with the same kind of ideas that would go into any kind of habit building or breaking. You just need to be consistent and spend a long period of time with those changes in behavior in order to make sure that that becomes a regular thing, in order to get your body used to these changes and condition things like your hormone release. And our last genetic-based, but really mainly this is more of a hormonal factor, is looking at leptin, the leptin hypothesis. And this is really just categorized under genetics because of when it was originally published or hypothesized. So in the 1950s, it was first published, this idea that there is some factor in the body that plays a large role in suppressing your appetite after you eat, and that maybe this hormone, this signal, isn't working the same way in people that overeat more frequently, right? And so at the time that this was first published, they didn't know the hormone until much, much later, until around 40 years later in the 1990s. We identified this as leptin, which is a hormone produced by your adipose tissue, your fat cells in your body, that is supposed to be released once you start absorbing fat and storing it. So as you eat your food and it's being digested and broken down, and that fat is being absorbed and transported through your circulatory system by those chylomicrons and taken to these adipose cells, the adipose cells would then release leptin, telling your brain, okay, we've eaten, no, we don't need that anymore. So it stimulates your satiety, tells you that you're full, and inhibits your feeling of hunger. And there have been lots of studies. It's very easy to study a particular hormone once you've identified it and have an idea of what its role may be. So there are lots of studies showing that leptin has this effect, that in response to the consumption of food and the storage of fat, a body will release leptin and the brain will respond to leptin by feeling full and inhibiting hunger. However, we have started to see that the circulating levels of leptin in obese individuals are much, much higher than in an average typical individual, which you might think would mean that they should be less hungry. That should be stimulating that satiety and inhibiting their hunger. But in fact, it seems to be having the opposite effect in that the body is no longer responding to this signal. So in the same way that insulin resistance can build by the overconsumption of simple sugars and thus lead to type 2 diabetes, your body can also tire from responding to leptin and no longer respond in the same way. And so even though obese individuals are releasing a lot of this hormone, their brain is no longer listening to that signal. And so they don't know that they're full, or they're at least not getting that signal that they're full. And so they continue to eat. And so in general, this is the pathway in which leptin is supposed to work. So while your fat cells are empty or lower in their fat storage, there is no leptin being released. And so your brain can stimulate that feeling of hunger and you would eat. After you've eaten and fat is starting to get put into these storage cells, these adipose tissue, those storage cells are going to release leptin, which tells your hypothalamus, hey, we're full, we don't eat anymore. And so that is going to tell you to stop eating. And so we've done lots of experiments in this to see the impact of completely removing leptin or using leptin as a treatment or transferring leptin between individuals. There's lots and lots of studies on manipulating leptin in different ways. But we'll just focus on really just this one example just to show how extreme of an impact leptin can have. So in this study, there were mice that had I don't want to say had. The researchers removed the gene for producing leptin from these mice. So the mice were unable to produce this hormone. Leptin was not being produced at all. And in these individuals where that hormone had been removed or the gene for the hormone had been removed, they would eat and eat and eat and eat and eat until they became extremely obese, around 3 times. They ended up weighing around 3 times as much as a normal or the average mouse. And so then if you come and give these mice leptin, so inject leptin into their bloodstream, remember they don't have the gene to produce it, so they won't do it on their own. But if you start giving them leptin treatments along with a regular food schedule, they would lose that weight very, very quickly and get almost to a normal weight or average weight for that population in a short amount of time. So by completely removing leptin from the system, they gained weight super, super quick. And at an extreme measure, they were 3 times as big as a normal or average mouse from this population. And then by simply adding leptin back into their circulatory system when they were eating, they lost that weight extremely quickly. So leptin definitely has a strong effect on an individual's weight. And just like how insulin had its opposing hormone glucagon, so insulin told the body that there is glucose in the blood and we should absorb it. Glucagon told the body we're low on glucose, we need to send some out. Leptin has its opposing hormone, ghrelin. So leptin tells the brain we're full, we don't need to eat anymore. Ghrelin does the opposite. Ghrelin tells the brain we need to eat. Right? We're low on molecules, we're low on food, we're low on fat storage. And this is produced by the stomach cells and hypothalamus, which is going to not only produce its own effect, but also block the effects of leptin. And so its job, again, is to increase your feeling of appetite and efficient energy storage. And so whereas we saw potential leptin resistance building in chronically obese individuals, we also see that ghrelin levels don't change in obese individuals. So whereas in a normal average individual, you would have changing levels of both leptin and ghrelin, depending on when you're eating and when you're not. In obese individuals, there is no decline in ghrelin. We have a lot of leptin being released, we have a lot of ghrelin being released, but the brain is not listening to that leptin telling it to stop eating, and it is consistently listening to that ghrelin telling it to keep eating, essentially. So this is essentially summarizing all of that information, showing the general pathway. You are absolutely not being asked to memorize these molecules and whatnot, but showing that these all interact at the hypothalamus. And so in a lean individual, ghrelin is released when they are fasted, when they have not eaten, telling the body telling the body you're hungry, and then ghrelin will decrease when you start eating. Leptin increases when you have been eating, telling the brain, okay, we have enough, you can stop, and then will decrease when fasted so that you have the opportunity to be hungry and eat again. But in obese individuals, we don't get this regular increase and decrease. Instead, we get consistent levels of ghrelin, constantly stimulating that you're hungry feeling with no drop off. And then we have chronically high levels of leptin to the point that they are likely creating a resistance and the brain is no longer responding to that satiety signal. So these hormones have a really, really strong impact. And so beyond that, there are other factors that we know likely have some impact on the amount of weight your body is carrying. There's this idea of childhood weight, which is strongly related to that set point hypothesis, that whatever general BMI your body gets used to at a young age, that sets your set point, and thus your body will want to maintain that as you grow larger, unless you use some consistent habitual change to manipulate that and condition that set point. Behavior, just like with any type of habit, it builds over long periods of time, and you may not realize that you're building a bad habit until you start to see the more long-term effects. And so working backwards is going to require the same type of work and conditioning. Any kind of habit building takes small, consistent changes over a long period of time in order to make that an actual habit. You can check out James Clear's book, Atomic Habits, for some great tips and explanation of the research around these ideas. And then lastly, social factors, which certainly likely have a strong impact depending on how food is utilized in your community, in your society, and with the people around you, with your culture, right? The behavior of those around you is going to strongly impact your feelings and behavior about food. So they kind of go hand in hand with behavior as well. All right. And so the last part of this chapter, again, I want to be the most careful here and tiptoe around this. It's something we have to discuss as a part of the textbook. But again, take this information with a grain of salt. There is no perfect way to evaluate body weight. And with our current understanding, it actually requires a lot of testing and technology to give you an actual accurate representation of a healthy body weight for you as an individual. So the measures we're discussing here are very basic. Right? So in general, a healthy body weight would be something that can be maintained without constant reduction or limiting diets. So you can still eat regularly without needing to fully cut something out of your diet. That body weight would allow you to be capable of completing your daily tasks with ease, so you shouldn't need to be straining in order to go about your day, and is going to promote healthful eating habits that allow for regular physical activity. And so the most simplistic way of evaluating body weight is to measure your body mass index. And this may be something that a doctor calculates for you just as a piece of information, but is absolutely not representative of your health, at least in any significant way, right? Your body mass index. If you look at the body mass index for things like heavyweight bodybuilders and weightlifters, heavyweight boxers, weightlifters, they would be considered extremely obese or morbidly obese individuals, even though we can clearly tell that they are extremely fit and active. And then same on the opposite end. If you were to look at the BMI for the highest level of marathon runners, they would be extremely underweight, which should put them at significant health risk. But instead, we see that they can do these incredible physical acts on a day-to-day basis, and they're consuming high amounts of calories. So BMI is very simplistic and should not be used on its own as a measure of evaluating whether or not your body weight is healthy. But this measure does show up, and so we can talk about it. In general, you would calculate your BMI by taking your weight in kilograms and dividing that by your height in meters squared. So if you want to do this calculation, you would need to convert your height, if you have it in feet and inches, into meters, and then square that value, so multiply it by itself in order to use that here. So you take your weight in kilograms and divide that by your squared height. And in general, a healthy body weight is supposed to be that which has a BMI of around 20 to 25. And then the cutoff for being underweight is anything below 18.5. And then being obese or overweight is going to be 30 or higher. But again, not a realistic determinant of health, and is not going to really be a great way of determining whether or not you are at risk. Okay? So in general, the idea is if your BMI is on the really low end, then you do not have enough energy storage in order to keep up with your basal metabolic rate. And so your body is going to constantly be breaking itself down in order to maintain itself. And thus you don't have enough energy to do things like fighting off infection, thus exposing yourself to increased risk. On the opposite end, if you have too much energy storage, you're utilizing too much energy keeping up this extra weight, and you're carrying a bunch of extra weight, and so you require more energy just to do your day-to-day activities. And so that is also potentially exposing you to other health risks. And then that just gets more severe the higher and higher you get in that overweight category or underweight category, right? So obesity is describing individuals generally with a BMI of 30 to 40, putting you at significant health risk. And then morbid obesity would be anyone with a body weight that is over 100% or more than double what would be considered the average body weight for a person at that height. And again, this we would assume would come with a very high risk for serious health complications like type 2 diabetes and high blood pressure and heart attack. And again, these may be indicators that you can utilize as like maybe I should get some more testing done, or that a doctor might utilize as an indicator for what types of tests they may want to do in order to evaluate your health. But on its own, BMI does not really tell you a whole lot, so do not take that to heart. And so the rest of the chapter is now looking at some general tips for achieving and maintaining a healthy weight, or losing weight or gaining weight if that's a goal that you have. So in general, again, going back to this idea of habit building, any kind of habit, such as changing your weight, is going to require gradual change over a long period of time. Not trying to do it all at once and rush it. This has to become a fully formed habit for life. That's going to include regular and appropriate physical exercise. Again, overworking yourself can do just as much damage as not doing anything. And yeah, that behavior modification technique, again, changing habits consistently. So in general, some tips the textbook provides for losing weight would be to follow the recommended serving sizes on your foods. So using that nutrition facts panel and trying not to go too far above it. And then reducing your intake of high fat and high energy foods. And I'll emphasize at least this second part, which we've discussed in multiple different perspectives. Right? In general, you want to be eating nutrient-dense foods rather than energy-dense foods. And so making that simple shift should help with the reduction of general weight your body is carrying and your overall health, because you're getting a lot more diversity of nutrients. And then regular physical exercise, no matter what side of the spectrum you are here, gaining or losing weights, or just maintaining your weight, you should try to incorporate regular physical exercise into your everyday routine. That at least has a lot of evidence supporting it, that your body is at its healthiest when it is able to exercise regularly, or using exercise regularly to maintain its health. Anyways, if you want to lose weight through exercise, you should prioritize physical activity that is going to preferentially burn fat. And we've talked about how our body utilizes fat as its main energy source at rest, and will start to shift more and more towards carbohydrates as you increase the intensity of your physical activity. So if you are trying to exercise in order to burn fat, you should try to do low intensity exercises for long periods of time, right? Like a long walk or hike or a very light jog, right? You should also try to incorporate some resistance in weight training so that you are starting to shift body weight from adipose tissue towards that lean mass, that more metabolically active muscle tissue. But that will also come with just incorporating exercise that you weren't doing before anyways. And then for gaining weight, we have kind of the opposite ideas. In general, if you're trying to gain weight, you should be trying to consume around 500 to 1,000 kilocalories more than your regular RDA, so that you have some extra calories to potentially store and help build these extra tissues. And that is usually best done by eating frequently throughout the day. So if you're only used to 2 meals a day, trying to incorporate a couple smaller meals, or I guess large snacks in between those meals throughout the day, that is going to give you an easier time getting these calories rather than trying to pack it all into those 2 meals. Try to avoid stimulants like nicotine and caffeine that increase your basal metabolic rates and also decrease appetite at the same time. So it's a double-edged sword, right? Same goes for things like ADD medication, right? That is a stimulant. Really, anything that you would consider a stimulant is going to have this effect of increasing BMR but decreasing appetite. So that's going to hurt your ability to gain weight. And then for the exercise component, rather than endurance-based training, focusing on resistance-based training that is going to stimulate that lean muscle tissue building, rather than your energy burning as its main goal. And something to keep in mind with any new incorporation of exercise, even if your goal is to gain weight and you're doing high levels of resistance training, you are likely going to experience a short period of weight loss before you get that weight gain, as your body is starting to get used to tapping into its energy storage. You may lose weight the first few weeks before you actually start gaining weight. So just keep that in mind and stick with it. You will get there as long as you are eating more energy, more calories than you're burning. And so that is all for this chapter. I will see you guys in the next one.